Hello everybody and welcome to another video. In today's video we are going to be doing something different. I got bored and now I'm gonna read the Harry Potter books. I'm not gonna read the first one because it's basically just filler, and if you want to know anything about the first one, it's basically just that he meets all the characters and his first year just has some shenanigans. So, I mean, I'm going to start out with the second one. I hope you like this video. If you do, please leave a like. I will be reading chapter, let's see, how many, there's 18 chapters in this book, so it's going to be a wheel. I'm going to read to chapter 4. Let's start off with 1, though. The worst birthday. Not for the first time, an argument had broken out over breakfast at number 4, Privet Drive. Mr. Vernon Dursley had been woken in the early hours of morning by a loud hooting noise from his nephew's, Harry's, room. "Third time this week," he roared across the table. "If you can't control that owl, it'll have to go." Harry tried yet again to explain. "She's bored," he said. She's used to flying around outside. If I could just let her out at..." "Do I look stupid?" snarled Uncle Vernon, a bit of a fried egg dangling from his bushy mustache. "I know what'll happen if that owl's let out." He exchanged dark looks with his wife Petunia. Harry tried to argue back, but his words were drowned by a long, loud belch from the Dursley's son, Dudley. "I want more bacon." "There's more in the frying pan, Sweetum," said Aunt Petunia, turning misty eyes on her massive son. "We must build you up while we've got the chance. I don't like the sound of that school food." "Nonsense, Petunia. I never went hungry when I was at Smeltling's," said Uncle Vernon heartedly. "Dudley gets enough. Don't you, son?" Dudley who was so large his bottom drooped over either side of the kitchen chair, grinned and turned to Harry. "Pass the frying pan." "You've forgotten the magic word," said Harry irritably. The effect of that simple sentence on the rest of the family was incredible. Dudley gasped and fell out of his chair with a crash that shook the whole kitchen. Mrs. Dursley gave out a small scream and clapped her hands to her mouth. Mr. Dursley jumped to his feet, veins throbbing in his temples. "I meant please," said quickly. "I didn't mean..." "What have I told you?" thundered his uncle, spraying spit over the table. "How about saying the M word in our house?" "How dare you threaten Dudley?" roared Uncle Vernon, pounding the table with his fist. I warned you. I will not tolerate mention of your abnormality under this roof." Harry stared from his purple-faced uncle to his pale aunt, who was trying to heave Dudley to his feet. "All right," said Harry, "all right." Uncle Vernon sat back down, breathing like a winded rhinoceros and watching Harry closely out of the corners of his small, sharp eyes. Ever since Harry had come home from his summer holidays, Uncle Vernon had been treating him like a bomb that might go off at any moment. Because Harry wasn't a normal boy. As a matter of fact, he was not as normal as it is possible to be. Harry Potter was a wizard fresh from his first year at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and if the Dursleys were unhappy to have him back for the holidays, it was nothing to how Harry felt. He missed Hogwarts so much, like it was having a constant stomachache. He missed the castle with its secret passageway and ghosts, his classes, though perhaps not Snape's, the potions master. The mail arriving by owl, eating banquets in the great hall, sleeping in his 4-poster bed in the tower dormitory, visiting the gamekeeper Hagrid in his cabin next to the Forbidden Forest in the grounds, and especially Quidditch, the most popular sport in the wizarding world. 6 tall Quirrell 4 flying balls and 14 players on broomsticks. All Harry's spellbooks, his wands, his robes, his cauldron, and top-of-the-line Nimbus 2000 broomstick had been locked in a cupboard under the stairs by Uncle Vernon the instant Harry had come home. What did the Dursleys care if Harry lost his place on the house Quidditch team because he hadn't practiced all summer? What was it to the Dursleys if Harry went back to school without any of his homework done? The Dursleys were what wizards would call muggles, not a drop of magical blood in their veins. And as far as they were concerned, having a wizard in the family was a matter of deepest shame. Uncle Vernon had padlocked Harry's owl, Hedwig, inside of her cage, to stop her from carrying messages to anyone in the wizarding world. Harry looked nothing like the rest of the family. Uncle Vernon was large and necklaced with an enormous black mustache. Aunt Petunia was horse-faced and bony. Dudley was blond, pink, and porky. Harry, on the other hand, was small and skinny, with brilliant green eyes and jet-black hair that was always untidy. He wore round glasses, and on his forehead was a thin, lightning-shaped scar. It was this scar that made Harry so particularly unusual, even for a wizard. The scar was the only hint of Harry's very mysterious past, of the reason he had been left on Dursley's doorstep 11 years before. At the age of 1 year old, Harry had somehow survived a course from the greatest dark sorcerer of all time, Lord Voldemort, whose name most witches and wizards still feared to seek. Harry's parents had died in Voldemort's attack, but Harry had escaped with his lightning scar, and somehow nobody understood why. Voldemort's powers had been destroyed the instant he had failed to kill Harry. So Harry had been brought up by his dad, mother's sister, and her husband. He had spent 10 years with the Dursleys, never understanding why he kept making odd things happen without meaning to, believing the Dursley story that he had got his scar in the car crash that killed his parents. Then exactly a year ago, Hogwarts had written to Harry, and the whole story had come out. Harry had taken up his place at a wizard school where he and his scars were famous. But now the school year was over. He was back with the Dursleys for a summer, back to being treated like a dog that had rolled in something smelly. The Dursleys hadn't even remembered that today happened to be Harry's 12th birthday. Of course, his hopes hadn't been high. They'd never given him a real present, let alone a cake, but to ignore it completely. At that moment, Uncle Vernon cleared his throat importantly and said, "Now, as we all know, today is a very important day." Harry looked up, hardly daring to believe it. "This could be the day I make the biggest deal of my career," said Uncle Vernon. Harry went back to his toast. Of course, he thought bitterly, Uncle Vernon was talking about another stupid dinner party. He'd been talking of nothing else for 2 weeks. Some rich builder and his wife were coming to dinner, and Uncle Vernon was hoping to get a huge order from him. Uncle Vernon's company made drills. "I think we should run through the schedule one more time," said Uncle Vernon. "We should all be in position at 8 o'clock. Petunia, you will be in the lounge," said Aunt Petunia promptly, waiting to welcome them graciously to our home. Good. And Dudley? "I'll be waiting to open the door." Dudley put on a foul, simpering smile. "May I take your coats, Mr. and Mrs. Mason?" "They'll love him," cried Aunt Petunia rapturously. "Excellent, Dudley," said Uncle Vernon. Then he rounded on to Harry. "And you?" "I'll be in my bedroom, making no noise, pretending I'm not there," said Harry tonelessly. "Exactly," said Uncle Vernon nastily. "I will lead them into the lounge, introduce you, Petunia, and pour them drinks. At 8:15, I'll announce dinner," said Petunia. "And, Dudley, you'll say, 'May I take you through to the dinner room, Mrs. Mason?'" said Dudley, offering his fat arm to an invisible woman. "My perfect little gentleman," sniffed Aunt Petunia. "And you?" said Uncle Vernon viciously to Harry. "I'll be in my room, making no noise, and pretending I'm not there," said Harry Dudley. Precisely. Now we should aim to get in a few good compliments at dinner. Petunia, any ideas? Vernon tells me you're a wonderful golfer, Mr. Mason. Do tell me where you bought your dress, Miss Mason." "Perfect, Dudley. How about... We had to write an essay about our hero at school, Mr. Mason, and I wrote about you." This was too much for both Aunt Petunia and Harry. Aunt Petunia burst into tears and hugged her son, while Harry ducked under the table so they wouldn't see him laughing. "And you, boy?" Harry fought to keep his face straight as he emerged. "I'll be in my room, making no noise, and pretending I'm not there," he said. "Too right you will," said Uncle Vernon forcefully. "The Masons don't know anything about you, and it's going to stay that way. When dinner's over, you take Miss Mason back to the lounge for coffee, Petunia, and I'll bring the subject around to drills. With any luck, I'll have the deal signed and sealed before the news at 10. We'll be shopping for a vacation home in Majorca this time tomorrow." Harry couldn't feel too excited about this. He didn't think the Dursleys would like him any better in Majorca than they did on Privet Drive. Right, I'm off into town to pick you up in the dinner jackets for Dudley and me. And you, he snarled at Harry, you stay out of your aunt's way while she's cleaning. Harry left through the back door. It was a brilliant sunny day. He crossed the lawn, slumped down on the garden bench, and sang under his breath, Happy birthday to me. Happy birthday to me. No cards, no presents, and he would be spending the evening pretending not to exist. He gazed miserably into the hedge. He had never felt so lonely. More than anything else at Hogwarts, more even than playing Quidditch, Harry missed his best friends, Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger. They, however, did not seem to be missing him at all. Neither of them had run into him all summer, even though Ron said he was going to ask Harry to come and stay. Countless times Harry had been on the point of unlocking Hedwig's cage by magic and sending her to Ron and Hermione with a letter, but it wasn't worth the risk. Underage wizards weren't allowed to use magic outside of school. Harry told the Dursleys this. He knew it was their only terror, that he might turn them all into dung beetles that stopped them from locking him in the cupboard under the stairs with his wand and broomstick. For the first couple of weeks back, Harry had enjoyed muttering nonsense words under his breath and watching Dudley tearing out of the room as fast as his fat legs would carry him. But the long silence from Ron and Hermione had made Harry feel so cut off from the magical world that even taunting Dudley had lost its appeal. And now Ron and Hermione had forgotten his birthday. What wouldn't he give now for a message from Hogwarts, from any witch or wizard? He'd almost be glad of a sight of his arch enemy, Draco Malfoy, just to be sure that it hadn't all been a dream. Not that his whole year at Hogwarts had been fun. At the very end of his last term, Harry had come face to face with none other than Lord Voldemort himself. Voldemort might be a ruin of his former self, but he was still terrifying, still cunning, still determined to regain power. Harry had slipped through Voldemort's clutches for a second time, but it had been a narrow escape, and even now, weeks later, Harry kept waking in the night, drenched in cold sweat, wondering where Voldemort was now, remembering his livid face and his wide mad eyes. Harry suddenly sat bolt upright at the garden bench. He had been staring absent-mindedly into the edge, and the hedge was staring back. Two enormous green eyes had appeared among the leaves. Harry jumped to his feet as a jeering voice floated across the lawn. I know what day it is, sang Dudley, waddling towards him. The huge eyes blinked and vanished. What? Said Harry, not taking his eyes off the spot where they had been. I know what day it is, Dudley repeated, coming right back up to him. Well done, said Harry, so you finally learned the days of the week. Today's your birthday, sneered Dudley. How come you haven't gotten any cards? Haven't you got friends at that freak place? Better not let your mom hear you talking about my school, said Harry coolly. Dudley hitched up his trousers, which were slipping down his fat bottom. Why are you staring at the hedge? He said suspiciously. I'm trying to decide what would be the best spell to set it on fire, said Harry. Dudley stumbled backward at once, a look of panic on his fat face. You can't. Dad told you you're not allowed to do magic. He said it'll chunk you out of the house, and you haven't got anywhere else to go. You haven't got any friends to take you. Trickery-pokery, said Harry in a fierce voice. Hocus pocus, squiggly-liggly. Mom! Howled Dudley, tripping over his feet as he dashed towards the house. Mom! He's doing the new you-know-what! Harry paid dearly for his moment of fun, as neither Dudley nor the hedge was in any way hurt. Aunt Petunia, knew he hadn't really done magic, but he still had to do a duck as she aimed a heavy blow at his head with a soapy frying pan. Then she gave him work to do, with the promise that he wouldn't eat again until he'd finish. While Dudley lolled around watching and eating ice cream, Harry cleaned the windows, washed the car, mowed the lawn, trimmed the flower beds, pruned and watered the roses, repainted the garden bench. The sun blazed overhead, burning the back of his neck. Harry knew he shouldn't have risen to Dudley's bait, but Dudley had said the very thing Harry had been thinking himself. Maybe he didn't have any friends at Hogwarts. Wish they could see famous Harry Potter now, he thought savagely as he spread manure on the flower beds, his back aching, sweat running down his face. It was 7:30 in the evening when at last, exhausted, he heard Aunt Petunia calling him. Get in here and walk on the newspaper. Harry moved gladly into the shade of the gleaming kitchen. On top of the fridge stood tonight's puddling a huge mound of whipped cream and sugared violets. A loin of roast pork was sizzling in the oven. "Eat quickly, the Masons will be here soon," snapped Aunt Petunia, pointing at 2 slices of bread and a lump of cheese on the kitchen table. She was already wearing a salmon-pink cocktail dress. Harry washed his hands and bolted down his pitiful supper. The moment he had finished, Aunt Petunia whisked away his plate. "Upstairs, hurry!" as he passed onto the door onto the living room. Harry caught a glimpse of Uncle Vernon and Dudley, both in bow ties and dinner jackets. He had only just reached the upstairs landing when the doorbell rang and Uncle Vernon's furious face appeared at the front of the stairs. "Remember, boy, one sound." Harry crossed to his bedroom on tiptoe, slipped inside, closed the door, and turned to collapse in his bed. The trouble was, there was already someone sitting on it. Dobby's warning. Harry managed not to shout out, but it was a close thing. The little creature on his bed had large, bat-like ears and bulging green eyes the size of tennis balls. Harry knew instantly that this was not what he had been watching him out of the garden hedge. This was what oh my god, I'm fucking retarded. This was what had been watching him out of the garden hedge that morning. As they stared at each other, Harry heard Dudley's voice from the hall. "May I take your coats, Mr. and Mrs. Mason?" The creature slipped off the bed and bowed so low that at the end of his long, thin nose touched the carpet. Harry noticed that it was wearing what he looked like old pillowcases with rips for arms and leg holes. "Hello," said Harry nervously. "Harry Potter," said the creature in a high-pitched voice Harry was sure would carry down to the stairs. "So long has Dobby wanted to meet you, sir. Such an honor it is." "Thank you," said Harry, edging along the wall and sinking into the desk chair next to Hedwig, who was already asleep in her large cage. He wanted to ask, "What are you?" but thought it would sound too rude, so instead he said, "Who are you?" "Dobby, sir. Just Dobby. Dobby the house elf," said the creature. "Oh, really?" said Harry. "I don't want to be rude or anything, but this isn't a great time for me to have a house elf in my bedroom." Aunt Petunia's high, false laugh sounded from the living room. The elf hung his head. "Not that I'm not pleased to meet you," said Harry quickly, "but there is any particular reason you're here?" "Oh, yes, sir," said Dobby earnestly. "Dobby has come to tell you, sir. It is difficult, sir. Dobby wonders where to begin." "Sit down," said Harry politely, pointing at the bed. To his horror, the elf burst into tears, very noisy tears. "Sit down," he wailed. "Never, never, ever." Harry thought he had heard the voices downstairs falter. I'm sorry, he whispered. "Oh, I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean to offend you or anything." "Offend Dobby," choked the elf. "Dobby has never asked to be sit down by a wizard, like an eagle." Harry, trying to say shh and look comforting at the same time, ushered Dobby back onto the bed where he sat. He coughing, looking like a large and very ugly doll. At last he managed to control himself and sat with his great eyes fixed on Harry in an expression of watery adoration. "You can't have met many decent wizards," said Harry, trying to cheer him up. Dobby shook his head. Then, without warning, he leapt up and started laughing, banging his head furiously on the window, shouting, "Bad Dobby! Bad Dobby!" "What are you doing?" Harry hissed, springing up and pulling Dobby back onto the bed. Hedwig had woken up with a particularly loud screech and was beating her wings wildly against the bars of the cage. "Dobby had to punish himself, sir," said the elf, who had gone slightly cross-eyed. "Dobby almost spoke ill of his family, sir." "Your family?" "The wizard family Dobby serves, sir. Dobby is a house elf, bound to serve one house and one family forever." "Do they know you're here?" asked Harry curiously. Dobby shuddered. "Oh, no, sir, no. Dobby will have to punish himself most grievously for coming to see you, sir. Dobby will have to shut his ears in the oven door for this, sir. If they ever knew, sir." "But won't they notice if you shut your ears in the oven door?" "Dobby doubts it, sir. Dobby is always having to punish himself for something, sir. They let Dobbies get on with it, sir. Sometimes they remind me to do extra punishments." "But why don't you leave? Escape?"
A house elf must be set free, sir, and the family will never set Dobby free. Dobby will serve the family until he dies, sir.
Harry stared. Okay. And I thought I had it bad staying here for another 4 weeks, he said. This makes the Dursleys almost sound human. Can't anyone help you? Can't I? Almost at once, Harry wished he hadn't spoken. Dobby dissolved against into wails of gratitude.
Please,
Harry whispered frantically.
please be quiet. If the Dursleys hear anything, if they know you're here. Harry Potter asks if he can help Dobby. Dobby has heard of your greatness, sir, but of your God goodness. Dobby never knew him.
Harry, who was feeling distinctly hot in the face, said, Whatever you've heard about my greatness is a load of rubbish. I'm not even top of my year at Hogwarts. That's Hermione. But he stopped quickly because thinking about Hermione was painful.
Harry Potter is humble and modest,
said Dobby reverently, his orb-like eyes aglow.
Harry Potter speaks not of his triumph over he who must not be named.
Voldemort, said Harry. Dobby clapped his hands over his bad ears and moaned,
Speak not of that name, sir! Speak not of that name!
Sorry, said Harry quickly. I know lots of people don't like it. My friend Ron. He stopped again. Thinking about Ron was painful too. Dobby leaned towards Harry and his wise eyes as headlights.
Dobby heard tell,
he said hoarsely,
that Harry Potter met the Dark Lord for a second time just weeks ago, that Harry Potter escaped yet again.
Harry nodded, and Dobby's eyes suddenly shone with tears.
Sir,
he gasped, dabbing his face with the corner of the grubby pillowcase he was wearing.
Harry Potter is valiant and bold. He has braved so many dangers already. But Dobby has come to protect Harry Potter, to warn him, even if he does have to shut his ears on the oven door later. Harry Potter must not go back to Hogwarts.
There was a silence broken only by the chink of knives and forks from downstairs and the distant rumble of Uncle Vernon's voice. What? He stammered. But I've got to go back. Term starts on September 1st. If it's all that's keeping me going. You don't know what it's like here. I don't belong here. I belong in your world at Hogwarts.
No,
squeaked Dobby, shaking his head so hard his ears flapped.
Harry Potter must stay where he is safe. He is too great, too good to lose. If Harry Potter goes back to Hogwarts, he will be in mortal danger.
Why? Said Harry in surprise.
There is a plot, Harry Potter. A plot to make most terrible things happen at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry this year,
whispered Dobby, suddenly trembling all over.
Dobby has known it for months, sir. Harry Potter must not put himself in peril. He is too important, sir.
What terrible things, said Harry at once. Who's plotting them? And Dobby made a funny choking noise and then banged his head frantically against the wall. All right, cried Harry, grabbing the elf's arm to stop him. You can't tell me, I understand, but why are you warning me? A sudden unpleasant thought struck him. Hang on, this hasn't got anything to do with with you-know-who, has it? You could just shake or nod, he added hastily as Dobby's head tilted wrongingly close to the wall again. Slowly, Dobby shook his head.
Not he who must not be named.
But Dobby's eyes were wide and seemed to be trying to give Harry a hint. Harry, however, was completely lost. He hasn't got a brother, has he? Dobby shook his head, his eyes wider than ever. Well then, I can't think of who else would have had a chance of making horrible things happen at Hogwarts, said Harry. I think there's Dumbledore for one thing. You know who Dumbledore is, don't you? Dobby bowed his head. Albus Dumbledore
is the greatest headmaster Hogwarts has ever had. Dobby knows it, sir. Dobby has heard Dumbledore's powers rival those of he who must not be named, to the height of his strength, sir. But, sir...
Dobby's voice dropped to an urgent whisper.
There are powers that Dumbledore doesn't. Powers no decent wizard.
And before Harry could stop him, Dobby bounced off of the bed, seized Harry's desk lamp, and started beating himself around the head with ear-splitting yelps. A sudden silence fell downstairs. 2 seconds later, Harry, heart-thudding madly, had heard Uncle Vernon coming into the hall, calling, Dudley must have left his television on again, the little tyke. Quick, in the closet, hissed Harry, stuffing stuffing Dobby in, shutting the door, and flinging himself onto the bed just as the door handle turned. "What the devil are you doing?" Uncle Vernon through gritted teeth, his face horribly close to Harry. "You've just ruined the punchline of my Japanese golfer joke. One more sound and you'll wish you never had been born, boy." He stomped flat-footed from the room, shaking. Harry let Dobby out of the closet. "See what it's like here?" he said. "See why I've got to go back to Hogwarts? It's the only place I've got. Well, I think I've got friends."
"Friends who don't even write to Harry Potter,"
said Dobby slyly. "I expect they've just been—" "Wait a minute," said Harry, frowning. "How do you know my friends haven't been writing to me?" Dobby shuffled his feet.
"Harry Potter mustn't be angry with Dobby. Dobby did it for the best."
"Have you been stopping my letters?"
"Dobby has them here, sir,"
said the elf, stepping nimbly out of Harry's reach. He pulled a thick wad of envelopes from the inside of the pellicose he was wearing. Harry could make out Hermione's neat writing, Ron's untidy scrawl, and even a scribble that looked as though it was from the Hogwarts gamekeeper, Hagrid. Dobby blinked anxiously up at Harry.
"Harry Potter mustn't be angry. Dobby hoped if Harry Potter thought his friends had forgotten him, Harry Potter might not have wanted to go back to the school, sir."
Harry wasn't listening. He made a grab for the letters, but Dobby jumped out of reach.
"Harry Potter will have them, sir, if he gives Dobby his word that he will not return to Hogwarts. Ah, sir, this is a danger you must not face. Say you won't go back, sir."
"No," said Harry angrily. "Give me my friend's letters."
"Then Harry Potter leaves Dobby no choice,"
said the elf sadly. Before Harry could answer, Dobby darted to the bedroom door, pulled it open, and sprinted down the stairs. Mouth dry, stomach lurching, Harry sprang after him, trying not to make a sound. He jumped the last 6 steps, landing cat-like on the hall carpet, looking around for Dobby. From the dining room, he heard Uncle Vernon saying, "Tell Petunia that very funny story about those American plumbers, Mr. Mason. She's been dying to hear." Harry ran up the hall into the kitchen and felt his stomach disappear. On Petunia's masterpiece of a pudding, the mountain of cream and sugared violets was floating up near the ceiling. On top of a cupboard in the corner crouched Dobby. "No," croaked Harry. "Please don't kill me."
"Harry Potter must say he's not going back to school."
"Dobby, please."
"Say it, sir."
"I can't." Dobby gave him a tragic look.
"Then Dobby must do it, sir, for Harry Potter's own good."
The pudding fell to the floor with a heart-stomping crash. Cream splattered the windows and walls with the dish shattered. With a crack like a whip, Dobby vanished. There were screams from the dining room, and Uncle Vernon burst into the kitchen to find Harry, rigid with shock, covered from head to foot in Aunt Petunia's pudding. At first it looked as though Uncle Vernon would manage to gloss the whole thing over. Just our nephew, very disturbed. Meeting strangers upsets him, so we kept him upstairs. He shooed and then shot the Masons back into the dining room, promised Harry he would flay him to within an inch of his life. When the Masons had left and handed him a mop, Aunt Petunia dug some ice cream out of the freezer, and Harry, still shaking, started scrubbing the kitchen clean. Uncle Vernon might have been able to make his deal if it hadn't been for the owl. Aunt Petunia was passing around a box of after-dinner mints when a huge barn owl swooped through the dining room window, dropped a letter on Miss Mason's head, and swooped out again. Mrs. Mason screamed like a banshee and ran from the house, shouting about lunatics. Mr. Mason stayed just long enough to tell the Dursleys that his wife was mortally afraid of birds of all shapes and sizes, and to ask whether this was their idea of a joke. Harry stood in the kitchen, clutching the mop for support as Uncle Vernon advanced on him, a demonic glint in his tiny eyes. "Read it!" he hissed evilly, brandishing the letter the owl had delivered. "Go on, read it." Harry took it, and it did not contain birthday greetings. "Dear Mr. Potter, we have received intelligence that a hover charm was used at your place of residence this evening at 12 minutes past 9. As you know, underage wizards are not permitted to perform spells outside of school, and further spell work on your part may lead to expulsion from said school. Decree for the reasonable restriction of underage sorcery, 1875, paragraph C. We would ask you to remember that any magical activity that risks notice by members of the non-magical community, Muggles, is a serious offense under Section 13 of the International Confederation of Warlock Statutes of Secrecy. Enjoy your holidays. Yours sincerely, Mafalda Hopkirk. Improper use of magical offense. Ministry of Magic. Harry looked up from the letter and gulped. You didn't tell us you weren't allowed to use magic outside of school, said Uncle Vernon. A mad gleam danced in his eyes. Forgot to mention it? Slipped your mind, I dare say. He was bearing down on Harry like a great bulldog, all his teeth bared. Well, I've got news for you, boy. I'm locking you up, and you're never going back to that school. Never, and if you try and magic yourself out, they'll expel you. And laughing like a maniac, he dragged Harry back upstairs. Uncle Vernon was as bad as his word. The following morning, he paid a man to fit bars on Harry's window. He himself fitted a cat-like flap in the bedroom door, so that small amounts of food could be pushed inside 3 times a day. They let Harry out to use the bathroom morning and evening, otherwise he was locked in his room around the clock. 3 days later, the Dursleys were showing no sign of relenting, and Harry couldn't even see any way out of his situation. He lay on his bed watching the sun sinking behind the bars of the window and wondered miserably what was going to happen to him. What was the good of magicking himself out of the room if Hogwarts would expel him for doing it? Yet life at Privet Drive had reached an all-time low. Now that the Dursleys knew they weren't going to wake up as fruit bats, he had lost his only weapon. Dobby might have saved Harry from horrible happenings at Hogwarts, but the way things were going, he probably would starve to death anyway. The cat flap rattled, and Aunt Petunia's hand appeared, pushing a bowl of canned soup into the room. Harry, whose insides were aching with hunger, jumped off the bed and seized it. The soup was stone cold, but he drank half of it in one gulp. He then crossed the room to Hedwig's cage and tipped the soggy vegetables at the bottom of the bowl into her empty food tray. She ruffled her feathers and gave him a look of deep disgust. It's no good turning your breakup at it. That's all we've got, said Harry grimly. He put the empty bowl back on the floor next to the cat flap and lay back down onto the bed, somehow even hungrier than he had been before the soup. Supposing he was still alive in another 4 weeks, what would happen if he didn't turn up at Hogwarts? Would someone be sent to see why he hadn't come back? Would they be able to make the Dursleys let him go? The room was growing dark. Exhausted, stomach grumbling, mind spinning over the same unanswerable questions, Harry fell into an uneasy sleep. He dreamed that he was on show in a zoo with a card reading Underage Wizard attached to the cage. People goggled through the bars at him as he lay starving and weak on a bed of straw. He saw Dobby's face in the crowd and shouted out asking for help, but Dobby called, "Harry Potter is safe there, sir," and vanished. Then the Dursleys appeared, and Dudley rattled the bars of the cage, laughing at him. "Stop it," Harry muttered as the rattling pounded in his sore head. "Leave me alone. Cut it out. I'm trying to sleep." He opened the eyes. Moonlight was shining through the bars on the windows, and someone was goggling through the bars at him. A freckle-faced, red-haired, long-nosed someone. Ron Weasley was outside Harry's window. "Ron!" breathed Harry, creeping into the windows and pushing up so that they could talk through the bars. "Ron, how did you... What the..." Harry's mouth fell open as the full impact of what he was seeing hit him. Ron was leaning out of the back window of an old turquoise car who was parked in midair. Grinning at Harry from the front seats were Fred and George, Ron's older twin brothers. "All right, Harry?" he asked George. "What's been going on?" said Ron. "Why haven't you been answering my letters? I've asked you to stay about 12 times, and then Dad came home and said you got an official warning for using magic in front of Muggles. It wasn't me, and how did he know? He works for the Ministry," said Ron. "You know you weren't supposed to do spells outside of school." "Oh, you should talk," said Harry, staring at the floating car. "Oh, this doesn't count," said Ron. "We're only borrowing this. It's Dad's. We didn't enchant it, but doing magic in front of those Muggles you live with. I told you I didn't, but it'll take too long to explain now. So, look, can you tell them at Hogwarts that the Dursleys have locked me up and won't let me come back? And obviously I can't magic myself out because the Ministry will think that that's the second spell I've done in 3 days, so..." "Stop gibbering," said Ron. "Well, we've come to take you home with us." "But you can't magic me out either." "We don't need to," said Ron, jerking his head towards the front seat, grinning. "You forget who I've got with me." "Tie that around the bars," said Fred, throwing the end of a rope to Harry. "If the Dursleys wake up, I'm dead," said Harry as he tied the rope tightly around a bar and Fred revved up the car. "Don't worry," said Fred, "and stand back." Harry moved it back into the shadows next to Hedwig, who seemed to have realized how important this was and kept still and silent. The car revved louder and louder, and suddenly, with a crunching noise, the bars were pulled clean out of the window. As Fred drove straight up in the air, Harry ran back to the window to see the bars dangling a few feet above the ground. Panting, Ron hoisted them up into the car. Harry listened anxiously, but there was no sound from the Dursleys' bedroom. When the bars were safe in the back seat with Ron, Fred reversed as close as possible to Harry's window. "Get in," Ron said. "But all my Hogwarts stuff, my wand, my broomstick, where is it?" "Locked in the cupboard under the stairs, and I can't get out of the room." "No problem," said George from the front passenger seat. "Out of the way, Harry." Fred and George climbed cat-like through the window into Harry's room. "You had to hand it to him," thought Harry, as George took an ordinary hairpin from his pocket and started to pick the lock. "A lot of wizards think it's a waste of time knowing this sort of muggle trick," said Fred, "but we feel their skill is worth learning, even if they are a bit slow." There was a small click and the door swung open. "So, we'll get your trunk, you grab anything you need from your room and hand it to Ron," whispered George. "Watch out for the bottom stair. It creaks," Harry whispered back as the twins disappeared onto the dark landing. Harry dashed around his room, collecting his things and passing them out of the window to Ron. Then he went to help Fred and George heave his trunk up the stairs. Harry heard Uncle Vernon cough. At last, panting, they reached the landing, then carried the trunk through Harry's room to the open window. Fred climbed back into the car to pull with Ron, and Harry and George pushed from the bedroom side. Inch by inch, the trunk slid through the window. Uncle Vernon coughed again. "A bit more," panted Fred, who was pulling from the inside of the car. "One good push." Harry and George threw their shoulders against the truck, and it slid out of the window into the back seat of the car. "Okay, let's go," George whispered. But as Harry climbed out onto the windowsill, there came a sudden loud screech from behind him, followed immediately by thunder of Uncle Vernon's voice. "That ruddy owl! I'd forgotten Hedwig!" Harry tore back across the room as the landing light clicked on. He snatched up Hedwig's cage, dashed onto the window, and passed it out to Ron. He was scrambling back onto the chest of the drawers when Uncle Vernon hammered onto the unlocked door, and it crashed open. For a split second, Uncle Vernon stood framed in the doorway. Then he let out a bellow like an angry bull and dived at Harry, grabbing him by the ankle. Ron, Fred, and George seized Harry's arms and pulled as hard as they could. "Petunia!" roared Uncle Vernon. "He's getting away! He's getting away!" But the Weasleys gave him a gigantic tug, and Harry's leg slid out of Uncle Vernon's grasp. Harry was in the car. He'd slammed the door shut. "Put your foot down, Fred!" yelled Ron, and the car shot suddenly towards the moon. Harry couldn't believe it. He was free. He rolled down the window, the night air whipping his hair, and looked back at the shrinking rooftops of Pivot Drive. Uncle Vernon, Aunt Petunia, and Dudley were all hanging dumbstruck out of Harry's window. "See you next summer!" Harry yelled. The Weasleys roared with laughter, and Harry settled back in his seat, grinning from ear to ear. "Let Hedwig out," he told Ron. "She can fly behind us. She hasn't had a chance to stretch her wings for ages." George handed the hairpin to Ron, and then a moment later, Hedwig soared joyfully out of the window to glide alongside them like a ghost. "So, what's the story, Harry?" said Ron impatiently. "What's been happening?" Harry told them all about Dobby, the warning he'd give to Harry, and the fiasco of the violet pudding. There was a long, shocked silence when he had finished. "Very fishy," said Fred finally. "Definitely dodgy," agreed George. "So he wouldn't even tell you who's supposed to be plotting all this stuff?" "I don't think he could," said Harry. "I told you, every time he got close to letting something slip, he started banging his head against the wall." He saw Fred and George look at each other. "What, you think he was lying to me?" said Harry. "Well," said Fred, "put it this way. Us elves have got powerful magic of their own, but they can't usually use it without their master's permission. I reckon old Dobby was sent to stop you coming back to Hogwarts. Someone's idea of a joke. Can you think of anyone at school with a grudge against you?" "Yes," said Harry and Ron together. "Draco Malfoy. He hates me." "Draco Malfoy," said George, turning around. "Not Lucius Malfoy's son?" "Must be. It's not a very common name, is it?" said Harry. "Why?" I've heard Dodd talking about him, said George. He was a big supporter of you-know-who. And when you-know-who disappeared, said Fred, craning around to look at Harry, Lucius Malfoy came back, saying he'd never meant any of it. Load of dung. Dad reckons he was right in you-know-who's inner circle. Harry heard these rumors about Malfoy's family before, and they didn't surprise him at all. Malfoy made Dudley Dursley look like a kind of thoughtful and sensitive boy. I don't know whether the Malfoys own a house elf, said Harry. Well, whoever owns him will be an old wizarding family, and they'll be rich, said Fred. Yeah, Mum's always wishing we had a house elf to do the ironing, said George. But all we've got is a lousy old ghoul in the attic and gnomes all over the garden. House elves come with big old manors and castles and places like that. You wouldn't catch one in our house. Harry was silent. Judging by the fact that Draco Malfoy usually had the best of everything, his family was rolling in wizard gold. He could just see Malfoy strutting around a large manor house, sending the family servant to stop Harry from going back to Hogwarts. Also sounded exactly like the sort of thing Malfoy would do. Had Harry been so stupid to take Dobby seriously? I'm glad we came to get you anyway, said Ron. I was getting really worried when you didn't answer any of my letters. I thought it was Errol's fault at first. Who's Errol? Our owl. He's ancient. It wouldn't be the first time he's collapsed on a delivery. So then I tried to borrow Herm's. Who? The owl Mum and Dad brought Percy when he was made perfect prefect, said Fred from the front. But Percy wouldn't lend him to me, said Ron. Said he needed him. Percy's been acting very oddly this summer, said George, frowning. And he has been sending a lot of letters and spending a load of time shut up in his room. I mean, there's only so many times you can polish a perfect badge. You're driving too far west, Fred, he added, pointing on a compass on the dashboard. Fred twiddled the steering wheel. So, does your dad know you've got the car? Said Harry, guessing the answer. No, said Ron. He had to work tonight. Hopefully we'll be able to get it back in the garage without Mum noticing we flew it. What does your dad do at the Ministry of Magic, anyway? He works in the most boring department, said Ron. The Misuse of Muggle Artifacts Office. The what? It's all to do with bewitching things that are Muggle-made. You know, in case they end up back in a Muggle shop or house. Like yes, last year, some old witch died and our tea set was sold to an antique shop. This Muggle woman who brought it took it home and tried to serve her friend's tea in it. It was a nightmare. Dad was working overtime for weeks. What happened? The tea pot went berserk and squirted boiling tea all over the place, and one man ended up in the hospital with sugar tongs clamped to his nose. Dad was going frantic. It's only him and an old warlock called Perkins in the office, and they had to do memory charms and all sorts of stuff to cover it up. But your dad, this car. Fred laughed. Yeah, Dad's crazy about everything to do with Muggles. Our shed's full of Muggle stuff. He takes it apart, puts spells on it, and puts it all back together again. If he raided our house, he'd have to put himself under arrest. It drives Mum mad. And that's the main road, said George, peering down through the windshield. We'll be there in 10 minutes. Just as well, it's getting late. A faint pinkish glow was visible along the horizon to the east. Fred brought the car level lower, and Harry saw a dark patchwork of fields and clumps of trees. We're a little way outside the village, said George, Ottery St. Catchpole. Lower and lower went the flying car. The edge of a brilliant red sun was now gleaming through the trees. Touchdown, said Fred, as with a slight bump they hit the ground. They had landed next to a tumble-down garage in a small yard, and Harry looked out for the first time at Ron's house. It looked as though it had once been a large stone pig pen, but extra rooms had been added here and there until it was several stories high, and so crooked it looked as though it was held up by magic, which Harry reminded himself probably was. 4 or 5 chimneys were perched on top of the red roof. A lopsided sign stuck in the ground near the entrance read, "The Burrow." Around the front door lay a jumble of rubber boots and a very rusty cauldron. Sauerkraut and fat brown chickens were pecking their way around the yard. It's not much, said Ron. It's wonderful, said Harry happily, thinking of Privet Drive. They got out of the car. Now we'll go upstairs really quietly, said Fred, and wait for Mum to call us for breakfast. Then, Ron, you come bounding downstairs going, Mum, look who turned up in the night. Down, and she'll be all pleased to see Harry, and no one would ever know we flew the car. Right, said Ron. Come on, Harry, sleep at the top. Ron had gone a nasty greenish color, his eyes fixed on the house. The other three wheeled around. Miss Weasley was marching across the yard, scattering chickens, and for a short, plump, kind-faced woman, it was remarkable how much she looked like a saber-toothed tiger. Ah, said Fred. Oh, dear, said George. Miss Weasley came to a halt in front of them, her hands on her hips, staring from one guilty face to the next. She was wearing a flowered apron with a wand sticking out of her pocket. So, she said. Morning, Mum, said George in what he clearly thought was a jaunty, winning voice. Have you any idea how worried I've been, said Miss Weasley in a deadly whisper. Sorry, Mum, but see, we had to... All three of Miss Weasley's sons were taller than she was, but they cowered as her rage broke over them. Bed's empty, no note, car gone, could have crashed, out of my mind with worry, did you care, never as long as I've lived, you wait until your father gets home, we never had trouble like this from Bill or Charlie or Percy. Perfect Percy, muttered Fred. You could do with a taking leaf out of Percy's book, yelled Miss Weasley, prodding a finger in Fred's chest. You could have died, you could have been seen, and you could have lost your father his job. It seemed to go on for hours. Mrs. Weasley had shouted herself hoarse before she turned on Harry, who backed away. I'm very pleased to see you, Harry dear, she said. Come in and have some breakfast. And she turned and walked back into the house. Harry, after a nervous glance at Ron, who nodded encouragingly, followed her. The kitchen was small and rather cramped. There was a scrubbed wooden table and chairs in the middle, and Harry sat down on the edge of his seat, looking around. He had never been in a wizard's house before. The clock on the wall opposite him had only had one hand and no numbers at all. Written around the edge were things like time to make tea, time to feed the chickens, you're late. Books were stacked deep on the mantelpiece, books with titles like Charm Your Own Cheese, Enchantment in Baking, and 1-Minute Feast. It's magic! And unless Harry's ears were deceiving him, the old radio next to the sink had just announced that coming up was Witching Hour with the popular singing sorceress Celestia Warbeck. Mrs. Weasley was clattering around, cooking breakfast, a little haphazardly, throwing dirty books at her sons as she threw sausages into the frying pan. Every now and then she muttered things like, Don't you know what you were thinking of? And never would have believed it. I don't blame you, dear, she assured Harry, tipping 8 or 9 sausages onto his plate. Arthur and I have been worried about you, too. Just last night we were saying we'd come and get you our own selves if you hadn't ridden back to Ron by Friday. But really, she was now adding these 3 fried eggs to his plate, flying an illegal car halfway across the country. Anyone could have seen you. She flicked her wand casually at the dishes in the sink, which began to clean themselves, clinking gently in the background. It was cloudy, Mum, said Fred. You keep your mouth closed while you're eating, Miss Weasley snapped. They were starving him, Mum, said George. And you, said Miss Weasley, but it was with a slight softened expression that she had started cutting Harry bread and buttering it for him. At that moment there was a diversion in the foam of a small red-headed figure in a long nightdress who appeared in the kitchen, gave a small squeal, and ran out again. Jenny, said Ron in an undertone to Harry, my sister. She's been talking about you all summer. Yeah, she'll be wanting your autograph, Harry, said Fred with a grin, but he caught his mother's eye and bent his face over his plate without another word. Nothing more was said until all 4 plates were clean, which took a surprisingly short time. Blimey, I'm tired, yawned Fred, setting down his knife and fork at last. I think I'll go to bed and... You will not, said Miss Weasley. It's your own fault. You've been up all night. You're going to denome the garden for me, and they're getting completely out of hand again. Oh, Mum, and you too, she said, glaring at Ron and Fred. You can go up to bed, dear, she added to Harry. You didn't ask them to fly that wretched car. But Harry, who felt wide awake, said quickly, I'll help around. I've never seen a denoming. That's very sweet of you, dear, but it's dull work, said Miss Weasley. Now let's see what the Lockhart's got to say on the subject. And she pulled a heavy book from the stack on the mantelpiece. George groaned. Mum, we know how to denome a garden. Harry looked at the cover of Miss Weasley's book. Written across it in fancy gold letters were the words, Gilderoy Lockhart's Guide to Household Pests. There was a big photograph on the front of a very good-looking wizard with wavy blonde hair and bright blue eyes. As always in the wizarding world, the photograph was moving. The wizard, who Harry supposed was Gilderoy Lockhart, kept winking cheekily up at them all. Miss Weasley beamed down on him. Oh, he is marvelous, she said. He knows his household pests all right. It's a wonderful book. Mum fancies it, said Fred in a very audible whisper. Don't be so ridiculous, Fred, said Miss Weasley, her cheeks rather pink. All right, if you think you know better than Lockhart, you can go and get on with it, and woe betide if there's a single gnome in that garden when I come out to inspect it. Yawning and grumbling, the Weasleys slouched outside with Henry behind them. The garden was large, and in Harry's eyes exactly what a garden should be. The Dursleys wouldn't have liked it, but there were plenty of weeds, and the grass needed cutting, but there were gnarled trees all around the walls. Harry had never seen spilling from every flower bed and a big green pond full of frogs. Muggles have garden gnomes too, you know, Harry told Ron as they crossed the lawn. Yeah, I've seen those things think they are gnomes, said Ron, bent double with his head in a peony bush. Little Santa Clauses with fishing rods. There was a violent scruffling noise. The pony bush shuddered, and Ron straightened up. This is a gnome, he said grimly. Get off me, squealed the gnome. It was certainly nothing like Santa Claus. It was small and leathery looking, with a large knobby bald head, exactly like a potato. Ron held it at arm's length as it kicked out at him with its horny little feet. He grabbed it around the ankles and turned it upside down. This is what you have to do, he said. He raised the gnome above his head. Get off me! He started to swing it in great circles like a lasso. Seeing the shocked look on Harry's face, Ron added, It doesn't hurt them. You've just got to make them really dizzy so they can't find their way back to the gnome holes. He let go of the gnome's ankles. It flew 20 feet into the air and landed with a thud in the field over the hedge. Pitiful, said Fred. I bet I can get mine beyond that stump. Harry learned quickly not to feel too sorry for the gnomes. He decided just to drop the first one he caught over the hedge. But the gnome, sensing weakness, sank its razor-sharp teeth into Harry's finger, and he had a hard job shaking it off until, wow, Harry, that must have been 50 feet. The air was soon thick with flying gnomes. See, they're not too bright, said George, seizing 5 or 6 gnomes at once. The moment they know the denoming's going on, they storm up to have a look. You'd think they'd have learned by now just to stay put. Soon the crowd of gnomes in the field started walking away, in a straggling line, their little shoulders hunched. They'll be back, said Juan as they watched the gnomes disappear into the hedge on the other side of the field. They love it here. Dad's too soft with them. He thinks they're funny. Okay. Just then, the front door slammed. He's back, said George. Dad's home. They hurried through the garden and back into the house. Mr. Weasley was slumped in a kitchen chair, with his glasses off and his eyes closed. He was a thin man, going bald, but the little hair he had was as red as any of his children's. He was wearing long green robes, which were dusty and travel-worn. What a night, he mumbled, groping for the teapot as they all sat down around him. 9 raids, 9, and an old Mundungus Fletcher tried to put a hex on me when I had my back turned. Mr. Weasley took a long gulp of tea and sighed. Find anything, Dad? Said Fred eagerly. All I got were a few shrinking door keys and a biting kettle, yawned Mr. Weasley. There was some pretty nasty stuff. That wasn't my department, though. Mortlake was taken away for questioning about some extremely odd ferrets, but that's the Committee on Experimental Charms, thank goodness. Why would anyone bother making door keys shrink, said George. Just muggle baiting, sighed Mr. Weasley. Sell them a key that keeps shrinking to nothing so they can never find it when they need it. Of course, it's very hard to convict anyone because no muggle would admit their key keeps shrinking. They'll insist they just keep losing it. Bless them, they'll go to any lengths to ignore magic, even if it's staring them in the face. But the things a lot have taken to enchanting you wouldn't believe. Like cars, for instance. Mr. Weasley had appeared, holding a long poker-like sword. Mr. Weasley's eyes jerked open. He stared guttedly at his wife. Cars, Molly dear. Yes, Arthur, cars, said Mrs. Weasley, her eyes flashing. Imagine a wizard buying a rusty old car, telling his wife all he wanted to do with it was take it apart and see how it worked. Well, really, he was enchanting it to make it fly. Mr. Weasley blinked. Well, dear, I think you'll find that he would be quite within the law to do that, even if he would maybe have done better to tell his wife the truth. There's a loophole in the law, you'll find, as long as he wasn't intending to fly the car, the fact that the car could fly. When Arthur Weasley, you made sure there was a loophole when you wrote that law, shouted Mrs. Weasley, just so you could carry on tinkering with all that muggle rubbish in your shed. And for your information, Harry arrived this morning in the car you weren't intending to fly. Harry, said Mr. Weasley blankly. Harry, who? He looked around and saw Harry and jumped. Good Lord, is it Harry Potter? Very pleased to meet you. Ron's told us so much about your sons flew that car to Harry's house and back last night, shouted Mrs. Weasley. What have you got to say about that, eh? Did you really? Said Mr. Weasley eagerly. Did it go all right? I mean, he faltered as sparks flew from Mrs. Weasley's eyes. That was very wrong, boys. Very wrong indeed. Let's leave them to it, Ron muttered to Harry as Mrs. Weasley swelled like a bullfrog. Come on, I'll show you my bedroom. They slipped out of the kitchen and down a narrow passageway to an uneven staircase, which wound its way zigzagging up through the house. On the third landing, a door stood ajar. Harry just caught sight of a pair of bright brown eyes staring at him before it was closed with a snap. Jenny, said Ron. You don't know how weird it is for her to be this shy. She never shuts up normally. They climbed 2 more flights until they reached a door with appealing paint and a small plaque on it, saying Ronald's room. Harry stepped in, his head almost touching the sloping ceiling, and blinked. It was like walking into a furnace. Nearly everything in Ron's room seemed to be a violent shade of orange. The bed in Rom's room seemed to be a violent shade of orange. The bedspread, the walls, even the ceiling. Then Harry realized that Ron had covered nearly every inch of the shabby wallpaper with posters of the same 7 witches and wizards, all wearing bright orange robes, carrying broomsticks, and waving energetically. Your Quidditch team, said Harry. The Chutley Cannons, said Ron, pointing at the orange bedspread with an embezzled, which was embezzled with 2 giant black C's and a speeding cannonball. 9th in the league. Ron's school spell books were stacked untidily in a corner next to a pile of comics that all seemed to feature the adventures of Martin Miggs, the Mad Muggle. Ron's magic wand was lying on top of a fish tank full of frog spawn on the windowsill, next to his fat gray rat, Scabbers, who was snoozing in on a patch of sun. Harry stepped over a pack of self-shuffling playing cards on the floor and looked out of the tiny window. In the field far below, he could see a gang of gnomes sneaking one by one back through the Weasley's hedge. Then he turned to look at Ron, who was watching him almost nervously, as though waiting for an opinion. It's a bit small, said Ron quickly. Not like the room you had with the Muggles, and I'm right underneath the ghoul in the attic. He's always banging on the pipes and groaning. But Harry, grinning widely, said, This is the best house I've ever been in. Ron's ears went pink. Okay, guys, well, that is up to Chapter 4. This is already an hour long, so I'm assuming a lot of you won't like this, because fucking there isn't any real comedy in this, and it isn't a gameplay. But I'm gonna do it now. I don't really care. Need something to do. So, yeah, this is probably gonna be a series that I do mostly over the summer. Reading all the books. Other than the first one, and maybe a couple others. But, yep. Hope you liked this video, guys. If you did, please leave a thumbs up. And if you like me as a person and want to see more of these series, please do subscribe. Peace out.